What is going on, everybody? Meteorologist Mike Linden coming at you live from the MyRadar studio here in Orlando, Florida. I hope that you are well this evening. It is almost time for Hurricane Laura. Right now, a Category 4 hurricane with wind speeds of up near 145 miles per hour, and there is the potential for further strengthening. We will get to the latest on Hurricane Laura in just a moment. I just wanted to introduce meteorologist Stefanie Lauber. She is, of course, one of the meteorologists on our team. She is here in studio. Of course, we are tracking, Stefanie, a very large, again, a major hurricane that's anything, of course, as you know, just reiterating for the folks at home, Category 3 and above. And what are we seeing out of Laura right now on the MyRadar app?
Like you said, Mike, major hurricane here. That starts at Category 3. Laura is sitting at a Category 4 hurricane. What you see behind me is from our previous advisory. So I want to tell you about some of the changes that have come out since the 5 o'clock Eastern, 4 p.m. Central Time advisory. So earlier today, Laura sitting at 140 mile per hour maximum sustained winds. As of the newest advisory, that is now increased. The storm has strengthened a bit. Now looking at maximum sustained winds of 45 miles per hour. And interesting to note, the pressure has dropped by 1 millibar. It was at 948. Now we are seeing some intensification, modest at that, 947 millibars. So this is a very potent, very powerful tropical cyclone moving into the small Gulf of Mexico. And I'm going to take you to our MyRadar app here. And if you've got the app, track along with us. Just want to point out some interesting things we've seen here over the past couple of hours on the radar. I've got the hurricane tracker pulled up here so you can see the path and the cone. We've had a couple feeder bands moving in over the coast of Louisiana, southern Louisiana, into northeastern Texas even. Texarkana is starting to get a little bit of that shower activity as well, and even parts of Mississippi too. So something that is interesting to note on the radar, we're just starting to switch over from that global radar going into the land-based radars from Galveston and Lake Charles that are pulled up. I want to bring this out to you now with our per station feature that lets us check out those individual radars, because there's something very interesting to note here. One second as I turn off the hurricane tracker. Let's turn on Lake Charles here. This is close to where our storm chaser Aaron Jack is, and just nearing so that we can begin to see the eye of major Hurricane Laura approach the coastline. Notice how neat and even the storm has become, and you see those reds popping up on the northern or top half of the eye wall there. That's some new convection, some strengthening. Something interesting about tropical systems is around 4 p.m. local time, we begin to see a pressure minimum in the atmosphere. So that's likely aided to the storm's ability to intensify, aside from the fact that there really isn't much to hinder Laura's intensification until it reaches landfall and begins to then weaken and eventually fall apart. But folks here along the coastline are going to be bracing for some pretty rough conditions, the biggest concern being with storm surge. So I'm going to zoom in and show you the place that's most carefully being watched by the National Hurricane Center for storm surge. So that's going to include this area, including Sabine Lake. And so this is about where the Texas coastline and the Louisiana coastline meets. And these folks here, you could see up to 20 feet of storm surge in this area. So it's going to be an interesting night here going into the next several hours. We're here to walk you through it. And Mike, you were talking about how notable this storm is for folks along this coastline and how we've been using 2005 as a kind of a benchmark comparison.
Exactly. I can actually pull up a graphic here that I have prepared of historical tracks from this particular part of the world, the Gulf Coast, where whenever we really get a storm, especially those that are fairly potent coming into the Gulf, the further strengthening just makes things really rough. I mean, catastrophic. Rough is really an understatement. Just look at the names here on your screen here. These are a couple of very, very noteworthy storms. Ike, Rita, Katrina, Andrew, Audrey, all Category 4 or 5. And again, that potential is most definitely there when it comes to the potential for Laura that is right now in the Gulf, is very close to making landfall. The potential is there for it to strengthen a bit more. I mean, a man, I mean, it's tough when you look at that radar and you look at the satellite imagery. Let me pull this up here. I can show you the tropical infrared imagery. Look at that incredibly well-defined eye. That is the telltale sign. The clearing out as well. That is the telltale sign of a powerful, powerful hurricane with a capital P here. Before we get into the rest of the data here, I just wanted to let you know, of course, if you are watching on social media, be sure to get involved with us. Ask us questions. We have a feature now in the live stream where we can actually pull up the chat and we can see the chat congregate from everywhere, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. So please ask your questions. Stefanie and I are here to answer those. We will take some time here toward the end of the stream to really answer as many questions that you guys have, but we have a lot to get to, let alone some of the graphics that we've prepared. We actually have my radar storm chaser, Aaron Jack, standing by. He is in Louisiana, and we will interview him live. We also have an interview with Chief Scientist Servesh Garamella, that is the My Radar Chief Scientist, and he will give you some insight as to kind of the bigger picture here, what the National Hurricane Center is looking at, and why we see storms such as Katrina, such as Laura, Michael that was in the Gulf of Mexico as well, why we see them rapidly intensify, and why that's been happening more and more so lately. So I guess what we'll do here is we'll just take a look at a few more graphics, and then we will get to Aaron. Again, he is standing by. And again, big shout out to Matt and to Damien. They are running things behind the scenes. Give them some kudos in the chat. Those guys have been working really hard to make sure everything that you guys see and hear across everything My Radar, those are the guys responsible. So big shout out to them. So now let's take a look at a few more things, and again, I promise we will get to Aaron. He's being awesome. He's standing by there. New dad, by the way. Big shout out to Aaron and the baby at home. So anyway, here's a look at the watches and warnings. Of course, Laura, you can see the satellite imagery there is just off the coastline, expected to make landfall later tonight, if not early tomorrow morning. We're talking closer to midnight tonight. It's not a question of if, it's now a question of when. And for the folks along the coastline there, you pretty much have run out of time to prepare. So I truly hope that for the people that live along the Gulf Coast of the United States, let alone Louisiana and Texas, but you just have to be prepared for something like this, as Aaron will talk about. It's the storm surge that is a major concern. A hurricane warning there in red in effect for almost all of the western Louisiana coastline and the upper Texas coastline. And if we take a look here at the water vapor, that ridge of high pressure that was once over Florida, I mean, that has weakened considerably. I mean, it's a good thing in the sense that it's not nudging it farther to the west, like for Houston and even down near Corpus Christi, although folks that live along that coastline of Texas could still be looking at some impacts from storm surge. Stefanie touched on this earlier as well, this trough of low pressure here. This is what's going to nudge Laura to the north and kind of push it along toward the east once it gets going here, but you can see that it has already begun to turn and it is barreling toward the coastline. Before we get to Aaron, let's take a look at these storm surge graphics that we have prepared for you, because in all of weather, we're talking natural disasters, the number one killer, it's not winds, it's not lightning, it's not hail, it's not snow, it's flooding. It's big time flooding and storm surge, and let alone the flash flooding that could come as a result of those intense rain bands hitting the coastline here. This storm surge warning is in effect for almost the entire Louisiana coastline and most of the upper Texas coastline there. Possible storm surge upwards of 7 to near 13 feet. That's a lot of water, folks, especially for those that live right along the coastline. Let's take a look at the latest information here from the National Hurricane Center with the potential. We can really get a granular look here and see what is going on. Look how far to the south that we are seeing the potential for storm surge. Near Palacios there, we actually have a surfline camera there we can take a look at as well. We shall do so here coming up. Galveston, Texas, near about a foot of storm surge, but look what happens as you get closer to the border there between Texas and Louisiana. Anywhere in red, and I can really zoom in here, anywhere in red is greater than 9 feet of storm surge. Again, expected to be upwards of near 13 feet in some spots. Again, I cannot reiterate how much water that is. Lake Charles, look how far inland the potential for storm surge goes. So again, even if you're not going to be hit by the eye or you're in the direct path, storm surge is still a huge threat from this type of event. This is a very big storm. We will continue to work our way eastward here. Again, anywhere in red is that greater than 9 feet total. And look what happens as we get toward almost the New Orleans area here. We're still seeing storm surge up near 2 to near 3 feet and all the way east as far as Mobile, Alabama. You aren't in the cone at all, and there is the potential for a foot of storm surge there. So again, that is the big concern here moving forward, and that will continue to be the major impacts that we see out of Laura. It's kind of already begun, and I think that this would be a great time here to bring in my radar storm chaser, Aaron Jajak. I've just got to switch my headphones here so I can hear Aaron. And Aaron he was earlier this morning near the Port Charles, or rather near the Sulphur area. But Aaron, where are you now?
Hey, I'm just, I'm in Lake Charles, basically. There's casinos back here behind me, you can see. And there's a body of water here. It's called West Lake. And that's that's the body of water that should end up spilling into Lake Charles later tonight when the surge comes up here.
So, based on what you've seen thus far and how you've seen things to develop, because you've been there since yesterday, right? What have you noticed with the community? What are people doing in the area to prepare? I mean, this is a monster storm sitting right off of the coastline.
Yeah, so I took a ride through Lake Charles yesterday, or earlier today. I was driving through Lake Charles, and it kind of struck me a lot of times when I chase these hurricanes. I come in, I see lots of windows being boarded up and lots of sandbags being put up. But I haven't really seen any of that today in Lake Charles. It was I went down there and shot some video in downtown, and all the businesses had their windows not boarded up. You could see right in. Maybe that's changed since this morning. I don't know. I don't think it did. I think it's probably still that way. And I don't, it's striking to me because usually there's a lot of prep, and maybe it's just people are deciding that the flooding is going to be so bad. What's the point anyway? I really don't know. It's strange.
Yeah, that is very strange, especially when you consider, as we looked at before, and I can pull those historical tracks up. We're talking about powerful hurricanes that have impacted that part of the world. Again, Katrina, Rita. Rita is the one that we've really been paying close attention to because the track is very similar to what Laura is doing right now. But compared to what you have followed in the past, Aaron, what do you expect here moving forward out of Laura? What are you most, I guess, worried about, being that you are there to storm chase?
Yeah, so definitely the biggest concern is what you touched upon earlier, is the surge. That's the thing I've been paying attention to the most, trying to figure out, where those inundations are going to happen. Where can I safely intercept the storm at? Having multiple plans. My current plan right now is I'm probably going to move back to the Sulphur area for the landfall tonight. And then I'm going to have to still pay attention to where it's going. It could wobble west or east of that location. And my goal is to get into that eye of that storm. And that makes it difficult down here in South Louisiana. It's just all swampland south of I-10. We're 30 miles of the coast. It's canals, bayous, just all swampland. So I may end up having to stay on Interstate 10, and that might be where I have to go anyway if the surge is, comes worst case scenario, surge happens.
And let's not forget, of course, 2020, I think both agree that 2020, a year to forget in terms of everything that has happened this year. There's a global health crisis going on, which is making matters even more difficult for emergency management officials to get people to shelter and of course, to have to follow social distancing and everything that's going on. It really is a lot, to say the very least. But have you even seen people beginning to evacuate? We did see some video that you shared earlier today of people getting horses onto a trailer and getting out of town. Have you seen a lot of that, or things are just quiet overall?
I mean, things have been really quiet, actually. It's been mostly like a ghost town. And maybe, you touched a good point there about the pandemic going on. Maybe people are, hesitant to go to those storm shelters and leave their homes with that
right.
going on. I don't know. I did see a little bit of evacuation on the coast, mostly livestock being moved off the coast. There were people obviously moving themselves off the coast. But a lot of times, like in Florida, you see those mass exodus of people moving up the peninsula, moving across the panhandles out and away from Florida. And I haven't really seen a lot of that. I-10 hasn't been that busy. Maybe people got out early because of Marco. Maybe there was a lot of early evacuations with Marco, and they knew another one was coming. I don't know, but it's been a little weird that it's been so not a lot of people before the storm. Now it's a good thing, obviously. Hopefully, though, they're not just hiding in their homes in places where there's going to be bad storm surge.
So before we wrap things up with Aaron here, I just want to throw out to the people watching, again, get your questions in right now. The fact that we have one of the best storm chasers in the business, we're talking to him live right now. Get your questions into the chat right now. And before we say goodbye to Aaron, I can ask him your questions. But Aaron, I wanted to ask you something else here. Looking ahead, once this thing has made landfall, of course, as you know, having chased tornadoes at night, when things like this, when the worst of Mother Nature are hidden, I mean, being the fact that there's no sunlight, what is it like? I mean, it's got to be a little scary, even though this is something that you do on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, I think it's where your other senses take over and become like your hearing. You really tune into that hearing, and you're listening for those sounds out there. And one of the weirdest things you'll see with these hurricanes when you chase them is a lot of times the hurricane comes in, those winds are wrapping around, and you've got winds that are actually coming from the north, coming across the land, and you'll see these rolling power flashes as that next surge of gust comes rolling your way. These flashes getting closer, and then you actually hear that wind approaching you, tearing stuff up. That's a real I think your other senses start taking over with your hyper awareness, hyper focus on what's going on. You can't see, so you got to listen and just do the best you can to keep yourself safe.
Okay, well, Aaron, I don't want to take up any more of your time here, especially considering what is to come here with Laura. We will get back to Aaron. Of course, Aaron is going to be very involved with coverage here through the rest of this evening and into tomorrow. Again, Chief Meteorologist Leslie Hudson will be in tonight to take you through the landfall, and we will likely have Aaron involved again. So again, if you have any questions for Aaron, get them into the chat. Ask us on social media. We will be sharing a lot of Aaron's content too, so you can ask him. I'll say, though, he may be a little busy to answer you. So again, follow us on YouTube, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Send us your questions. We will try our best to answer them. Aaron, is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we say goodbye, at least for now?
I would say if you're in Louisiana on the southern coast and you're south of I-10, you should definitely not be south of I-10 right now. You should be getting north and getting out of there. And even in where I'm at around I-10 isn't going to be safe. So if you have somewhere you can evacuate, keep going north, get to your family, and go, you don't even want to go straight north because there could be Hurricane 1, Cat 1 force hurricane winds all the way up to Shreveport by tomorrow morning. So get yourself away from the Louisiana coast, move east or west away from it, and everything will be all right.
Wise words, Aaron. Thank you so much. All right, you take care. We will talk to you later this evening. Stay safe, Aaron.
All right, thank you. Talk to you guys later.
Okay. There goes Aaron. All right, let me pop these headphones back in. I want to bring meteorologist Stefanie Lauber back in so we can talk to her based on where Aaron is. We had some interesting questions coming in on the chat there. Stefanie, somebody asked here in the chat, let me find the question here. David Reynolds, he asked, as strong as it is, could there be eye wall replacement which could potentially weaken the storm? Can you speak to David's question, Stefanie?
So it's actually a really good question. That's something that I was looking for when I was focusing on the eye of the storm, is we're not quite seeing that right now. In fact, it looks like maybe we would have seen that eye as it's become neater now. It wouldn't be going through a replacement cycle because right now as it stands, it is formed its neat open eye. And going through tonight, would we see another one? That would be really helpful, but I'm not sure there's much time before this storm comes ashore. It is moving very quickly. We told you at the latest advisory, speed on this storm was 15 miles per hour, which doesn't seem like a lot. That's a school zone for folks. But for these massive storms, that's very quickly for a movement. But something else I wanted to point out here while I've got the MyRadar app handy, and if you have our per station feature, something to point out, we got a number of tornado warnings coming in on this band that's been moving through southern Louisiana So if we pop that up, I can show you. I'll turn on the watches and warnings so you can see. Here's that band, and then these pink magenta areas, if I pop them up, these have been the tornado warnings that have been coming up here. This one in particular is in effect for southern St. Helena Parish in southeastern Louisiana. That goes into Livingston Parish, East Feliciana Parish, and that's going to go until, let's see if we get this up here, issued at 4:41 p.m. And so that's going to go until about just after 5:10 p.m. And it looks like we may be past that. No, this is local time. But something I wanted to bring up on our velocities, something so interesting when these bands come ashore is that we have the risk for tornadoes, because as the bands move, they're moving in that rotation is already inherent, because these are storms that are spinning counterclockwise. So these bands come spinning ashore, and as it meets the friction of land, we get that low-level vorticity, to use the jargon here, and that creates these quick spin-up tornadoes that usually only come up for about a radar scan or two. And especially, you see these purple, looks like almost static here on the radar. That's range folding. We're kind of meeting or exceeding the range of this radar. And so it becomes a bit difficult for the National Weather Service forecasters to get a good, clear picture of what's going on there. And so they've been erring on the side of caution here and issuing these tornado warnings for any of that rotation that could be embedded in this band. And it looks like for this band that's going over the bottom of the boot, as I like to call it, here in Louisiana and even southern Mississippi, we do have some potential for these quick spin-up tornadoes here in this band. So something to be mindful of, even if you're not directly in the path of the center of this storm. You have to be mindful as these rain bands move on through. But Mike, what other questions do we got there from some folks who are watching us?
Well, I really hope Jeffrey Sands on YouTube that answers your question. He said that we're ignoring them on YouTube when Stefanie answered the question right away at explaining tornado genesis in hurricanes, and there you go. It's important to remember that yes, hurricanes are deadly with what they can bring with storm surge and of course the winds, but as Stefanie touched on, it's those rain bands that could be far away from the center of circulation that can still bring with them major impacts. Let me see what other questions that we have here before we get to some more graphics here. Well, we actually have a comment here, Stefanie, from Tom. He says he lives 175 miles east of Lake Charles, and they are getting slammed with those rain bands. So if you want to, I guess, pull up on the app there, we can take a closer look at that area, because I believe that is that's right there, kind of in the track. Am I correct? It's right near, he said, 175 miles east of Lake Charles in Maurepas. I may be pronouncing that incorrect. Maurepas. Hey, the French accent there.
I don't speak French, but I have a little bit of influence there. Let's see if I can find on the map here. We can pinpoint exactly where he is. I see Opelousas. We are
regardless,
going along
those
10
those
here.
Rain
but
bands are coming in there,
yeah,
big time.
We can pinpoint this stuff, but quick band just moving through. And again, 15 miles an hour may not seem very fast, but these are those bands that are in and out, and with it dumping very heavy torrential rainfall. You heard Aaron talking about the conditions he's seeing there, so it's a doozy here as we see these bands come on shore. But the nice thing is, for folks that are only dealing with a feeder band, if I can find one silver lining with this, is that they are quick moving. But of course, that's the problem with these massive storms, is their sheer size. And you know, not every tropical system is huge, but this one in particular, a very symmetrical looking storm and rather big in size. So with that, those impacts are more widespread and farther ranging.
Stefanie, Jeffrey Sands on Facebook, all capital letters. Thank you, Stefanie.
You got it.
All right, another question here before we jump back into the graphics, Stefanie here, from Natalie on YouTube. Do you think that this storm could upgrade to a Category 5 before it hits land? And I think maybe to rephrase that question just a little bit here, let's talk about rapid intensification. I mean, just over the past couple of years, we've seen storms that, the one, again, that continues to come into my mind is my namesake, Michael. We saw that storm, you know, it was there. I mean, there was tropical activity, and within, 36 hours, it was a behemoth of a storm because of how warm the Gulf of Mexico is. So again, I guess, is there the possibility that this storm could further strengthen? I mean, 145 miles per hour, it's not too far away from tipping the scales. And I think a great point that you made earlier was, Is there really a difference between 145 and 140? I mean, yes, numbers wise, but in terms of the damage that it brings, it's pretty rough.
Comparing to, say, a storm like Michael, just, yesteryear, I had a friend who actually went through pretty close by to Michael, wasn't directly in the path, but in the panhandle of Florida. And this was a storm that he's watching because folks along the Big Bend of Florida are dealing with the storm surge from this too. And something that's interesting to note, he texted me this morning saying, hey, I went to bed last night and Laura was a Category 1. I woke up this morning, we're in Category 4 territory here. What's going on? And so that's kind of the interesting thing about these systems, and in particular the Gulf of Mexico. We like to call it a bathtub. Folks who live along the coastline would probably agree. Very warm water, so there's a lot of fuel for these systems, and especially into the overnight. You may think without daytime heating, how are these storms growing into these mammoth systems? But into the overnight, it's actually more conducive for these systems to develop, and so that's where you get that rapid intensification. But to answer the question, whether we'll see this tip the scale of Category 5, again, I'm not sure we have enough time for the center of this storm to do that before it makes landfall. Something else that was buzzing around the National Hurricane Center's discussion on their page, I saw a couple advisories ago, is that they're really hoping that the trough that has been steering this system right into that Texas-Louisiana border will kind of produce some shear in the upper levels and kind of put maybe, if we can call it, a weak cap on this storm to try to hinder the intensification somewhat. And again, like you mentioned, Mike, I don't know if there's that much difference in when it comes to how destructive these systems are when it comes from 145 mile per hour winds to 155 mile per hour winds. One comparison I like to make when people try to gauge, well, 60 miles an hour, 70 mile an hour winds, what is that? If you're driving down the highway and you put your windows down, it's pretty chaotic. That's Category 1 hurricane or maybe even tropical storm strength. If you're a race car driver, then maybe you know what Category 4 winds feel like with the windows down. But yeah, this is a powerful force of nature here that's about to make its way onto the Gulf Coast.
Right, and it's not something like a tornado, right? That is, at least when you put it into relative terms, those are over very quickly. This is likely to be a prolonged event. That's what makes them so deadly. And you spoke about the shear, and we've been mentioning that in the days leading up to it. Folks just asking, is there anything that could work against Laura and Laura's development? And yes, that shear is there. I mean, it could work to at least limit things just a little bit, but it's almost at this point here where will it work to break it down in much of a major way? If that's what people are thinking, likely that's not the case. I mean, it may help a little bit here, but it's pretty much ready to rock at this point, and it is very much so ready to rock the coastline. Let's take a look at these weather graphics here, and then we're going to get to another interview that we have with Chief Scientist Servesh Garamella. He actually spoke about rapid intensification earlier. He's a super intelligent guy, so I think you guys would really like what he has to say. And then, of course, we are still here. We are standing by for any questions that you may have. It's probably the most fun interacting with you guys, and any way that we can help is fantastic. So let's take a look at these graphics here. Stefanie, I pulled up the HRRR, the High Resolution Rapid Refresh model. This is a model, as you well know, but for the folks at home, this is a model that is updated or only gives you 18 hours worth of data. So it's a very short-term model when you compare it to some of the other players that we've talked about, the GFS, the European, and what have you. But this particular model is updated every single hour, so it can really give us a good idea as to what to expect here. And just looking at this model, I mean, now we're really starting to see a lot of agreement, and the National Hurricane Center, of course, is shrinking their cone, and it's really starting to line up here with a lot of models. But look at the time here, folks, 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, we may indeed see these models start to really pick up on how fast Laura is moving, considering the size, and it may certainly make landfall before that, because remember, we just need the eye to be on land. And gosh, I mean, just seeing it every time here, whether it's on satellite imagery or on the models, it's still rough. And look at this, into Thursday afternoon, 1:30. Stefanie mentioned that those Category 1 hurricane force winds extending northward into northern Louisiana and potentially even into Arkansas as well. On the model, still showing somewhat of an eye there from Laura, even after it has been disconnected fully from its fuel source. That, of course, is the very warm bathtub Gulf of Mexico. Stefanie, I will definitely be stealing that one from you. I like that. Let's take a look here at one more model. Let's look at the RPM model, and then we'll send it over to the interview with Servais. So again, the RPM model is another high-resolution model that we have available to us. Again, I'm going to put things in motion for you here. And again, look at the time, very early into Thursday morning. If you live along the Gulf Coast, your time to prepare is pretty much up. You're kind of at the point now where you need to just hunker down and stay as safe as you possibly can. A very dangerous situation really unfolding, let alone the tornado threat that is unfolding right now over southern Louisiana. And again, following that path, a lot of agreement on all of the major models. That is what we are seeing, at least right now. So what we're going to do, and we're going to, again, keep things going here. We're going to run this interview, then come back. We'll answer any questions that you may have. We're also going to show you some live pictures from our partners at Surfline as well as at WeatherStem in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as well as in Palacios, Texas there. So we'll have a live look at things. Stefanie's still going to be monitoring the My Radar app, so we'll keep all of that going to keep you guys engaged. But again, we have this interview that I shot earlier this afternoon with Chief Scientist Servais Garamella. He is kind of the big brain in the company, if you will, in the sense where if you use those rain notifications in the app, you're looking at the guy that pretty much came up with them. And they are very, very accurate. We are big fans of that. We're, of course, big fans of Servais, and we wanted to share with you some of his insight as to what he was looking at, kind of on a big picture here, atmospheric-wise, and just looking at essentially what some of the best tropical meteorologists, that being the folks at the NHC, the National Hurricane Center, what they are looking at when it comes to forecasting a monster storm such as Laura. So let's send it to the interview with Servais. But again, when we come back, we will answer any questions that you may have. Get them in the chat now. Here's the interview with Servais. And Chief Scientist Servais Garamella, all the way from Portland, Oregon. Servais, how are you this afternoon?
Doing great, Mike. Thanks so much for asking to interview me. And it's a really interesting day in the world of atmospheric science and meteorology with the landfall of Laura today is quite dramatic.
Yeah, absolutely. We've certainly seen this storm, let alone the track, shift dramatically from where it originally was from the NHC, which is to be expected. But now, just in the past 24 hours, we've seen this storm seemingly blow up over the incredibly warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. I wanted to chat with you, being that you are the chief scientist in the company. What exactly does that mean for the folks that are watching, or they're listening, or however they are watching this? What do you do as the chief scientist for the company?
So as the chief scientist, I am in charge of the R&D activities. So roughly how that translates is taking the data and information that are available out in the world and observational platforms, modeling platforms, and distilling that down into actionable information for our users. So how can we take science data and transform it into something that's useful? And figuring out how to connect those dots are part of my purpose here.
So to essentially distill it down, you take the numbers and you make them easier for people to understand in a more accessible way. Would that be fair to say?
Totally. And my job is to make sure that's useful, because if you're just inundated with a flood of data and numbers and don't really know how that affects the decisions you're making, then more isn't necessarily better. So what we're trying to do is improve the quality of information we deliver to the users of My Radar in order to improve the decisions that they have to make.
Okay. So now we've established that numbers are what you are. You're the tip of the spear numbers guy, right? So with the NHC, I've said this rather, I guess in a kind of fun way, but I think it's very true that the meteorologists at the NHC are almost the Navy SEALs of tropical meteorology. They're kind of the best of what we have to offer here in the United States. With the data that they are looking at, is it any different from what a meteorologist or even a casual weather enthusiast at home, is it any different from the data that they're looking at, or are they looking at something incredibly more complex?
So they're looking at a very, very rich data set. So at the National Hurricane Center, like you mentioned, some of the best minds in the field of tropical meteorology are working on these problems to figure out how these hazards are going to affect real life people. So in addition to the data that we see, that's sort of a more distilled version of what is available, they're looking at the raw satellite data, they're looking at observational data from ships and buoys, they're looking at the raw aerial reconnaissance. When they fly a hurricane hunter into the storm and they collect a bunch of data, that all goes into the Hurricane Center so they can improve their guidance and figure out what the behavior of the storm is currently doing and how that'll affect the eventual track and intensity. And then as it gets closer to land, we can start picking it up on radar, which is what we focus on in the MyRadar app, and also other observation sensors and networks are thrown into the mix to provide the NHC as complete as possible a picture of what the atmosphere is doing in the near environment of the storm. And you take all of these observations and you pump them into really sophisticated weather models that have slightly different treatments of slightly different variables and slightly different phenomena. So you get a range of votes. So I don't know if you've ever seen a spaghetti plot where the projected track of the cyclone is shown as it's predicted by different models, and based on taking that large amount of information, they're able to distill it down into a best track, best guidance, arrival time of winds, and all of these other useful metrics that stakeholders need to make their decisions.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned in an earlier live chat, and pretty much any time that we are doing any kind of event like this, that those models are model guidance, right? That people at home can't look at that and go, boom, that's it, that's where it's going, and take it as the gospel. It's model guidance. Definitely.
The important thing to note in looking at any sort of weather prediction, numerical weather prediction output, is understanding when that model is good and when that model has trouble. So a rule of thumb that I learned in school that I like to lean on when I'm looking at an ensemble of models to try to make some guidance or some decisions is that all models are wrong, some models are useful. And so when is the model going to be useful versus when is it going to be less useful is part of what the experts at the Hurricane Center are including in their information, because they're getting information from dozens of models and dozens of observational platforms, and they've got to sort of do the mining and sift through what is less and more reliable in order to provide high quality decision support that influence our actions.
Right. So let's take it back to Laura now. We've seen just a rapid strengthening and intensification in the incredibly warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, as of now, there's nothing really in the way to kind of slow Laura's roll down or to weaken it at any point. I mean, maybe some teeny bit of shear to the north, but certainly not enough to push it back or to weaken it in any way. Let's talk about rapid intensification. It's something that in the past couple of years has really applied to really any storm that has gotten caught into the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, Hurricane Michael comes to mind, where it just started as, almost a little bitty nothing, and within 24 to 36 hours, it's Category 5 hurricane impacting the panhandle of Florida. Why has rapid intensification become more and more in the forefront of minds of meteorologists, especially during this time of year?
So rapid intensification is really important to consider in the lifetime and evolution of a tropical cyclone, and it's mostly fueled by the available heat from the sea surface temperatures being high. So when you think of a hurricane or one of these storms, the fuel that they need to keep the circulation going is derived from the surface ocean. And the warmer the surface ocean is, the more fuel these storms will have to intensify. And especially in the nearshore environments, the Gulf or off the coast of Florida, where we saw Dorian rapidly intensify over the Bahamas last year, the measurements that we have. So I mentioned earlier that the National Hurricane Center includes lots of observational data. So we have a good idea of what the sea surface temperature is doing now, and the dramatic intensification, the rapidly intensifying nature of these storms is going hand in hand with observed increases in sea surface temperature. And so we know that there's extra fuel. to drive these storms, and we have really good observations of what sea surface temperature have been doing. And when we go measure those temperatures and observe that they're higher, this sort of rapid intensification trajectory of storms, it becomes increasingly likely and increasingly hazardous in the coastal environment.
So now, would it be fair to say that rapid intensification and the warming of the sea surface temperatures, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico, can be tied directly to climate change?
Certainly. The changes in the ocean heat uptake and the land heat uptake as a result of CO2 being released into the atmosphere and trapping more heat into the system, such that these storms have more energy. And there's been lots of research looking at what's called the potential intensity of these storms, and the potential intensity is rooted in how much energy they have available. And as we add energy available to these storms, the probability of their rapid intensification only increases, and that's something that's directly attributable. And there's more and more research suggesting there's increasing evidence that it's more and more attributable to a changing climate.
Okay. Servesh, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to speak with us. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that I might not necessarily have touched on? Of course, it's going to be a very pressing 24, let alone 24, couple of hours for folks that live along the coastline of the Gulf Coast there.
Yeah, as someone who spends a lot of time on the numbers and the data, I think about these problems from trying to understand them, but when when the force of Mother Nature comes to bear, especially for communities in the Gulf right now, thoughts and prayers go out to those communities and those families, and I just hope everyone can do their best to stay safe.
Of course, we all wish the exact same. Servesh, thank you so much again. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks so much.
Available to us later this evening once Chief Meteorologist Leslie Hudson takes over. But Stefanie, I mean, we're talking about a very intelligent guy, so I really wanted to pick his brain, especially considering numbers are his forte. He talked about the models. I know that we're all big on the models. Every meteorologist is going to look at all of the options available to us. But, you know, what do you like about the particular models, I guess?
Well, first of all, great information to get from him there and insight. He's got a good climatology background. Of course, he's chief scientist for a reason. The guy's got a lot of know-how in all of this and makes a lot of these cool features in our app very useful. But something to kind of circle back about the models with this, we're showing you one now, the HRRR. That's the, let's see if I get these R's right, the High Resolution Rapid Refresh model. I think those R's were in the right order. But excuse me, this model is great because it's convection allowing. So that kind of is a finer resolution. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that's a 3 kilometer resolution. Yeah. So this really picks up on some of those more fine-tuned kind of details in what the computer calculations are coming out with. And so this is what we love to use when we show future radar. These are the kinds of models that we're showing. And you can see already we're going to get some pretty strong thunderstorms moving along this track and likely to be moving through places like Little Rock, Fayetteville, Arkansas, even Memphis could be seeing some of those stronger storms as Laura moves inland and eventually begins to weaken. Another model that is great to look at, the RPM, also a finer resolution model that I believe this one is also convection allowing. So that means it helps pick up on some of the finer details in some of those thunderstorms. And as this one goes through, you'd see pretty good agreement. These all look pretty much alike, and we could see some banding continuing on into tomorrow as the storm makes its way inland and kind of travels up the Mississippi River there. Some other models that are very useful and perhaps don't look as pretty when you look at them here. This is the Euro. You may have heard that term before. Notice it's not as fine detailed looking, but this is a global model. This takes into account some of the more bigger synoptic features, and this is incredibly useful because this takes into account those steering mechanisms we were talking about over the past couple of days and what's really churning Laura along its path here. And with that, in contrast, we think of them as friends as opposed to competitors. The GFS, the Global Forecast Model, or the American model, another global suite here of calculations that go into future forecasting the storm as it makes its way onshore. And all of these in fair agreement that we will still have some very strong severe weather conditions as Laura makes its way inland and up the Mississippi, virtually across parts of the Midwest. So some of the latest information that's been coming in, you see it behind me here, our update from the app. Winds, maximum sustained winds, that's got it in that category 4 range, 144 miles per hour. But look at this, gusting. Some gusts within the strongest thunderstorms of Laura near that center in the eye wall have been measured as high as 173 miles per hour. So that would be gusting in that strong category 5 kind of category there. And so with that, those are gusts. They won't be all throughout the storm, but that's still powerful. Those are the kinds of conditions that could really cause some severe structural damage and really factor in for that wind threat with the storm, likely to find that closest to the center. Of course, the eye of the storm is calm, but the strongest thunderstorms in the hurricane or any tropical system like that is going to be in that band surrounding the eye wall. So I want to dance around the app here, if you will. Something that we're seeing, the transition from the global radar here in our app, picking up on those station radars, the land-based radars. So this one picking up on a suite from Lake Charles and Houston radars here. And let's track some of the weather that's happening with these bands, since we've seen some larger bands move on shore. We told you about some tornadic cells that were moving through this band here in southern Louisiana. So far, a lot of those have been allowed to expire, but definitely still a threat as we head on to the next several hours, and even potentially after landfall as these bands come around. Remember, we talked about how these are caused by the bands rotating and moving on shore, plus adding in the friction of land as they come off the water and do that. That's why we have that tornado threat with these tropical systems moving on through the New Orleans area. You're about to get some stronger storms, even back towards the panhandle of Alabama and perhaps the panhandle of Florida, even into the Big Bend, seeing some storms that over Florida, it's really a combination of the sea breeze and the influence there, the moisture that Laura is bringing towards the north here. But going on to the other side of the storm, notice these thunderstorms go into the middle Mississippi up towards Arkansas already, and then on the other side towards the Texas side of the storm, you notice places like Corpus Christi, San Antonio, places that need rain, albeit not a whole bunch at once, staying dry. That's because of that steering mechanism that is on the west side of the storm, kind of acting as a shield almost for these thunderstorms. Notice as they come on shore, a lot of that rain is evaporating out, so we're not getting the heavy rainfall in places along the I-35 corridor in the middle and southern portions of Texas. But yeah, we're getting some very strong rip current conditions, rough surf along the coastline, the coastal bend of Texas. Galveston Bay, you're under the risk of seeing strong storm surge. And an update that we got from the National Hurricane Center here at the top of the hour was that low tide has been reached. So those water levels are only going to go up from here. This is the lowest point here. So high tide will be coming into the evening hours and likely going to be very close to the arrival of this storm on land.
Ugly, ugly stuff, Stefanie. Need I remind everyone watching to get your questions into us. We actually lost our Facebook stream there for just a moment, but we are back on Facebook. Comments are getting spicy on YouTube as well. We will get to that in just a moment. Again, Matt and Damien, if you guys can put up the social handles there for those of you that are watching at home, you can ask us a question on Facebook, Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, YouTube. I think I said Facebook twice, but ask us the questions there and we will get to them. We can pull the chat up on screen as well. We're really trying our best to be as interactive as possible here. So let's talk about some of these questions that you guys have. I actually saw one here on Facebook or on YouTube that was fairly interesting here. And Stefanie, I think you might have touched on this a little bit here. Where did it go here? It was in regards to the shear and how that could potentially steer things from the shear from Marco steering things to the northeast. I mean, when we talk about the steering currents for this storm, we're talking about the big trough over Texas, right? I can pull that graphic up here so we can look at the water vapor imagery. You can do that within the My Radar app as well. But you were talking about, I mean, we were all talking about this in the days leading up to this. With what you're seeing on the water vapor imagery with that big trough over Texas, that ridge over Florida has really weakened considerably. But this this trough over Texas, where do we expect things to go from here?
So something that I was talking about when we were showing part part of the app, and I'll go to our winds layer here in a moment, but looking at the water vapor here on WSI, Mike's got that circled really well. If you see that orange color and those darker shades of gray, that's dry air. And you'll also notice we've got this looping feature. So that's actually coming in from the left-hand part of your screen, swooping down to the bottom extent. You see that orange going off the screen, and then up towards the northeast. So that is kind of why you see that fanning blue color going off the top over by Texarkana, moving into Oklahoma. That is the shear we're talking about. So the shear being where there's a wind direction change. So on that side of the storm that Mike's highlighting right there, it's trying to spin counterclockwise, whereas the winds, because of that trough, are going in the opposite direction. So those want to race towards the northeast. So that opposing wind direction there is really the fight that is going to be steering Laura, eventually continuing on this northwesterly path, but really pushing it into where Texas and Louisiana meet. So when we talk about tropical systems, you've heard us say it 100 times. Mike was just reiterating this. They love those warm waters, and right now the surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico are, as we said earlier, bathtub style. We're talking more than 80 degrees, probably mid 80s, upper 80s for sea surface temperatures. And so once Laura comes on shore, we cut off that fuel source, but it's not just fuel. We're talking about the exhaust in the upper part of the atmosphere. So if you think of the atmosphere as layers, these things they're like a cake, they go all the way up. So in the upper part, we like to have that exhaust feature, but this shear kind of disrupts that a little bit. So, that's going to keep a lot of that rain that I was showing you on the radar here from making it too far inland for parts of Texas, along, again, the I-35 corridor and up through Oklahoma. That doesn't mean we won't see any rain in parts of North Texas or Oklahoma, but that means a lot of that rain will be fizzling out as it makes its way onshore. And this upper level feature, this is water vapor, so we're looking at about 300 millibars. This is flight level and maybe even above that. So that helps steer this storm away, and that's the wind shear we're talking about. I'm going to jump over to the MyRadar app now and show you our winds layer, where you can choose between surface winds or 500 millibars, so that's 18,000 feet.
Way
and
that
shows it too, where you got that counterclockwise spin on the storm.
Yeah, I mean, as a lot of the comments are asking, Stefanie, a lot of people are very curious. I guess they're hearing kind of those buzzwords, right? Shear, which is a big one in severe weather, in hurricane forecasting as well. And it seems that a common question here is, when is that turn to the northeast going to begin? I mean, we can already kind of see Laura beginning to turn north. But again, as Stefanie just touched on, it's this trough here to the west that is eventually, when we say trough, just imagine like on the barnyard, right, with the animals are drinking out of, it's a trough. That is low pressure, whereas this ridge that was once a lot stronger here over Florida, ridge being high pressure. Remember, the winds around a trough spin counterclockwise. A hurricane is just a gigantic center of low pressure, but there's a lot of spin here. It's really trying to send it northward, but that shear that we're talking about, I highlighted it, but it's right here-ish, where you're trying to see those winds that are trying to come in from the north while it's working against these winds coming in almost in the opposite direction. Not having a humongous impact on Laura, but it is certainly worth pointing out. But Stefanie, people are wondering, with this track from the NHC here, and I can pull it up for us here. Here it is from the National Hurricane Center, that this is a fairly long track, and it is going places, to say the very least, maintaining near hurricane strength almost all the way through Louisiana, up and through Arkansas, eventually weakening course to a tropical depression. But Stefanie, I'm sure you can attest to this as well. Once things have weakened to a tropical depression, people aren't necessarily out of the woods. You're not going to get storm surge. You're not going to get those incredibly significant winds, but we are talking a lot of rain accompanied with this system as it treks its way through Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, West Virginia. It's going to cover a lot of miles in just a short period of time.
And as you mentioned, pointing out this track, notice that sharp right turn. We are making our way out to the East Coast here and eventually out to Delmarva. So even by the weekend, we expect the storm to be approaching the East Coast. So Laura still keeping up that quick pace as the system moves onshore, maintaining some intensity, because remember, this is not your average thunderstorm. This is a complex of thunderstorms, a huge low pressure system. And with that, it's going to take some time to weaken as it comes on shore. That's why we've been trying to get folks to pay very close attention to this forecast, even if you're not immediately on the coastline, because it still poses a threat as what's left of the system as it's weakening, moving onshore. But as we just showed you on water vapor, that trough helping to steer this storm way out on that right turn and eventually out to sea. And it's interesting to see this updated track, because it'll be interesting to see what exactly happens once Laura reemerges off the coast of the Delmarva there. Not going to have tropical characteristics. It's not going to be a tropical anything, just remnants of a tropical system, but it's going to be very windy for folks out there. Rough seas to be expected for portions of New England going into the weekend, right up the coast of Maine and eventually into the Canadian Maritimes. Going to see some rough surf, so that's definitely a concern heading into the next several days. But we're just focusing on the beginning part of the track here. Something to keep in mind as we head on through the weekend and the beginning of next week. We'll still be talking about Laura.
All right, so we could continue talking for hours and hours and hours. One thing that you may not know, lifting the curtain on meteorologists or the broadcast meteorologists, those you may see on your local TV station, unless there's severe weather most of the time, for your main weather hit where you get all the information in the 7-day forecast, you're limited to a good 2 to 3 minutes. So the opportunity to talk to you guys for more than an hour, I mean, this is you know, we're certainly in favor of it. But in terms, someone was asking about the rainfall working its way through eastern Texas, at least from the National Hurricane Center. The expectation is that around landfall, which is right there on that border of Texas and Louisiana, potentially upwards of near 10 inches of rain. I mean, that's near a foot of rain, folks. That's a lot, let alone the storm surge all the way northward, near 4 to 6 inches of rain almost all the way through Arkansas, and things continue to stay very, very wet, working their way again through the point where a bunch of states interact, that being Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas, upwards of a good 2 to 4 inches of rain. Now, before we say goodbye, we've got to talk about the Saffir-Simpson scale. This is what you use to measure hurricane intensity, or at least this is how it's categorized. Of course, there are only 5. Do not buy into any of the stuff that you see on social media saying, oh, category 6. That just does not exist. The highest that we go is a category 5. And here's how things essentially ramp up. A category 1, 74 to 95 mile per hour winds, minimal damage. We're talking tree limbs coming down, potentially spotty power outages. We are well past the point of a category 1. In fact, that could still be the case in northern Louisiana once this thing makes land. But again, cut off from that fuel source. That's really the silver lining with all of this, unlike something like Hurricane Harvey that wobbled there on the coastline of Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. Category 2, 96 to 110 miles per hour. We're talking just a little more intense than the Category 1, where let alone some tree limbs, some weaker trees can come down. I mean, plastic, patio furniture out there, that is getting lifted to Category 1, let alone Category 2. But things get a little more intense here as we get into the major range. Category 3 and above, we're talking devastating damage. What does that mean? Well, that means roof shingles on lesser constructed homes starting to come off. Weaker structures starting to move around at that point. Again, 111 to 129 miles per hour. As Stefanie said, imagine like you're driving down on the highway and you have the windows open. I'm not suggesting you drive this fast for the record, but boy, you're talking about some very strong winds. And now we get into Category 4. This is catastrophic damage, with, of course, the storm surge upwards of near 11 to 13 feet, let alone these wind speeds. Catastrophic damage. And then Category 5, which is what Laura is kind of teetering on. It's definitely on the edge, and the strengthening possibility is certainly there. I'm sure the National Hurricane Center will be watching this to the millimeter as it works its way toward the coastline. And Chief Meteorologist Leslie Hudson compared to Category 5 hurricane, and of course she was on the ground for Hurricane Michael in the panhandle of Florida, compared it to a war zone. That's really what it looks like after this. We're talking the landscape is forever changed from a Category 5 storm. I know that may sound extreme, but we are dealing with extreme circumstances. A catastrophic hurricane working its way toward the coastline right now as a Category 4, and of course with as warm as the Gulf of Mexico is, I mean, there's still time. And as Stefanie touched on, as long as that storm is over the bath that is the Gulf of Mexico, it is going to grow and grow and grow. We can only hope that that shear to the north will work to kind of cut it down a little bit in the upper levels. But at this point, it's almost like standing at the base of a mountain to try to prevent a boulder from rolling down. It is rolling here, and there's not much we can do to stop it. That is why you certainly need to be needed to have been prepared at this point. So I think at this point, Stefanie, we've been talking now for over an hour. Of course, Chief Meteorologist Leslie Hudson will be back this evening to take you through landfall. So if you, Matt and Damien, if you guys want to bring us up on a two-shot here just so we can close things out. Again, big shout out to Matt and Damien pulling all the strings behind the scenes. Those guys are rock stars, the unsung heroes, if you will. I'm losing my voice. Yeah, Team No Sleep, losing my voice. Those are the guys that are really pulling all the strings behind the scenes. Anything that you see, My Radar, they are behind when it comes to our video, social media content. Big shout out to both those guys. So again, Stefanie and I will be here throughout the course of the storm. Stefanie will be here this evening to assist with Chief Meteorologist Leslie Hudson. I will be back into tomorrow morning once this storm has made landfall. But Stefanie, is there anything that you'd like to mention here before we say goodbye? Again, at the bottom there are all of our social media channels. Be sure to follow us there. Stefanie, anything else you'd like to mention?
Just a shout out to everyone. Be safe. Thanks for following us. We're here to help guide you guys through this storm, so stay with us. You can depend on us to give you the nitty gritty with all this tough science jargon. If you have any questions, even when the live stream ends, please put them in the comments below. We'll be trying to stay on top of that, and we'll be bringing more interviews going into tonight and just giving you all the information you need to walk you through this storm. And thank you, Mike, for getting all these graphics set up and kind of guiding us through this for the past several advisories. You've been on top of this, so great job. Go team here at My Radar. We're working around the clock to keep you guys safe.
That's what we're here to do. Again, as Stefanie mentioned, be sure to get your questions into us. We pride ourselves on being very interactive with you guys. So get those questions in. There's no such thing as a silly question. Get those questions into us. We will answer them as best we can. Again, we will be back through the course of the evening. Chief Meteorologist Leslie Hudson will be there for landfall, taking you all the way through it. And again, from all of us here at Team My Radar, please stay safe, stay dry, and we'll catch you in the next one.